record and start the presentation. So welcome everyone to our last Science Policy PD workshop for the National Science Policy Network's first ever Science Policy Professional Development Week. Thank you for participating in as little or as much as you have done already. We still got more stuff to come, so it's going to be great. And with this workshop, I am happy and honored to introduce Chanel Matney, who serves as the Mentorship and Professional Development Coordinator with the National Science Policy Network. She's earned her doctorate in neuroscience from Johns Hopkins, where her research used electrophysiology to map cortical circuits. While there, she co-founded the Johns Hopkins Science Policy Group. After graduating, Chanel hopped between multiple short-term work and volunteer opportunities in strategic communications, editorial support, policy analysis, and policy advising in the Washington D.C. area. Around 3 years ago, Chanel headed out to the West Coast to work on education policy as a California Council of Science and Technology, or CCST, Science Fellow in 2019, followed by a stint as a committee staffer in the California State Legislature, where she worked on transportation issues. These days, Chanel works at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine as a program officer in the Forum for Neuroscience and Nervous System Disorders, which is to say she's awesome and amazing, and we're happy to have her here. If you ever need to step out for whatever reason, we will be recording this session and it will go up on our YouTube later on. But I hope you all have a wonderful time, and I will go ahead and let Chanel take it away.
Thank you, Annabelle, for that wonderful introduction. And hello, NSPN. To the extent that you're able to turn on your camera and let me see all your beautiful smiling faces, I would certainly appreciate the opportunity to connect with you guys. But thank you so much just for showing up for this workshop on goal setting. Hi, Anthony. Appreciate you being here. This topic is really, this topic is really near and dear to my heart because, as was sort of alluded to in my bio, I've switched roles maybe 5 or 6 times in the past 4 or 5 years. And so with that rapid turnover, getting into new jobs, there's a lot of sort of efficient goal setting that has to happen when you're getting oriented to a new culture, a new enterprise, new responsibilities. And some of you may empathize with that feeling of overwhelm. What's important? What's important to do first? How do I know which of the many opportunities available to me are relevant? How do I manage my limited time? So whether you're a very early career researcher, maybe first or second year grad student, just getting into the splash of science policy and figuring out where your interests are, or whether you're more experienced with science policy and you're trying to figure out the next steps career-wise, this sort of making smart goals framework is really helpful for organizing one's thoughts and one's sort of limited stash of time and energy to be maximally efficient. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started, and I will figure out how to share my screen. Just give me a sec. Let's see. How's that? What do you guys see? Title page?
Yes.
All right, awesome. So smart goal setting, a workshop. Let's go. Okay, well, first, a bit of a history lesson. I was sort of curious about where some of the principles that we're going to talk about today came from. The goal setting strategy we're going to talk about today is actually a relatively young concept, at least in the West. Management by objectives, or management planning, as it was originally coined, was first popularized in the 1950s, which is not that long ago, by an Austrian-American business management consultant, educator, and writer named Peter Drucker. And he's widely considered a founder of modern business management theory. And so he has a pretty long bibliography of books and articles that explore the various strategies, some optimal and some not, that people use to organize an enterprise around shared objectives, whether in business or in government or nonprofit organizations. So while a lot of the core concepts of management by objectives weren't, new in and of themselves, he was one of the first people of renown anyway to gather all those elements together into a sort of cohesive framework. And generally, and when I say this framework, it's going to sound really familiar to you. And that's because of how over time, it's just really penetrated the cultural business management zeitgeist. And so it doesn't seem like rocket science, but someone had to come up with the idea. And so it's things like setting a major organizational level goal, setting objectives that will help you pursue those goals, monitoring progress as you go along, evaluating the extent to which you are meeting certain benchmarks, and then rewarding folks, giving them positive feedback for their achievements, right? I mean, sounds really familiar to us. We're going to talk specifically about the part that relates to objectives, right? Often goals and objectives are used interchangeably. Waiting for my slide to proceed. Hold on a second. Okay. Often these terms are used interchangeably, but in this context, there's a really appreciable difference, right? A goal is meta, capital G goal. It's an overall direction or mission statement. It's big, it's maybe a little bit abstract, and it's guided by your values and your priorities, right? It's broad in scope, it's large, achieving this goal may take a number of years. An objective, on the other hand, are a series of specific actions and steps that must be taken in order to achieve that larger goal. So for the one meta capital G goal, you're probably going to have a series of very actionable objectives, right? And so one pitfall, I think, when it comes to goal setting is that the goal is so big and people often have a hard time splitting it down into smaller, more manageable chunks. So when we refer to SMART goals or smartifying a goal, first, you sort of name, what your mission is. What is it that you're trying to do over this longer time scale? That's the goal. And to smartify the goal, you identify these individually delineated objectives that are going to help you achieve that target. And those objectives we refer to as being SMART, right? So this is a mnemonic device that helps you make sure that your objective have these key characteristics: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, right? So let's dive into these a bit more specifically. My animations are all messed up. I converted from Google Slides to PowerPoint. And so there was clearly something lost in translation. So forgive me for that. Okay. So the top of the slide says specific. I'm so sorry that it's cut off. Again, the conversion seems to not really have worked in my favor. But specific means clear, tangible, and focused. In order to help us get there, it often helps to start with the 5 W's of your goal setting. Who's involved? Who's a member of your team? Obviously, it includes yourself, right? But it may also involve your PI, a mentor, a boss, accountability buddies, teammates and colleagues, to sort of have to understand the landscape of all the folks who may have some responsibility, right? Number 2 is really, really key. What small, concrete, you can wrap your hands around it, step or task am I trying to accomplish, right? Like getting really, really granular is often the most difficult part. The good thing about SMART goals is that there are multiple objectives underneath any one of them. And so you can stack them on top of each other, right? Many little goals together, and each of them will have the SMART characteristics. Okay. Thinking very broadly about timeline. When is it due? Often it's pretty straightforward when there's an external deadline, like the fellowship is due on November 1st, let's say for the AAAS. But we can also set internal deadlines for ourselves. For example, according to the academic year, or over the course of a season, like summer, or over the course of a calendar year, for example. This is an important one. Where does completion of the objective get me, right? What's the reward? How does the end outcome further your larger mission statement? And then finally, why do you care? Why are you personally motivated? And that's really quite significant because I was doing some, light reading on the sort of psychology of goal setting. And they found that when folks sort of shift their attention to thinking about the intensity of the effort, their ability to appreciate the reward of the outcome diminishes. And the more that folks were sort of wringing their hands over the difficulty, and this is really hard, and I don't think I'm doing so well, that ended up sort of eroding their confidence, eroding their sense of discipline. But when folks were able to visualize and focus on, this is the end result, I know that if I complete this task, I'll be more competitive for a job, or I'll have a great network connection, that was able to help them sort of pull through, those difficult, often in the dark moments when you're just feeling really frustrated. And so it's really important that one can identify, why does one personally care? Why are you invested in holding on to that and being able to visualize that? Because achieving goals takes a lot of perseverance. It's not easy. And one of the ways that people can fall off is just to get discouraged or to fall into sort of a paralysis over time, which is very human and very understandable. So that's specific. All right, now my slides are back to looking normal. Measurable. Well, many of us here are scientists and scholars, and so this one should be pretty familiar to us. We have to provide a way to quantify progress using metrics, establishing targets and benchmarks, right? This would be a good opportunity for me to enter in an example. So let's take the example of a NSPN member who's new to the science policy field. They're just sort of getting their bearings, and they're sort of like, I don't know what I don't know. My goal is to just be broadly exposed to science policy opportunities, right? Like how much, bigger and vaguer can you get? That is a perfectly appropriate goal for someone who's relatively new, to a field, right? And so one way that one can make that measurable is to break it down a little bit and say, okay, I can't expose myself to the whole entire world of science policy right away. Perhaps I can pick 3 fields that I want to expose myself to. So that's one measurement. I want to expose myself to 3 broad fields. And let's just say they pick science communication, congressional work, legislative policy, and science diplomacy. All right, so they have their 3 fields. Then they say, all right, if I have 3 fields and I want to do this over the course of about a year, maybe I can explore one field about every 4 months. Again, you're getting into metrics, you're measuring, you're setting benchmarks for yourself. That person could say, all right, explore these 3 fields. How does one explore something? Well, I can read on my own. They can set a benchmark for a certain number of books or white papers or reviews they want to read. I can learn from others. They could set a benchmark or a metric for how many informational interviews they might want to have, or how many free online conferences they might want to attend, right? This, honestly, I think is the most difficult part about drilling down into these goals, is like making it a specific task that you literally schedule on your calendar. At 3 p.m., I'm going to read this article about science diplomacy, and that's furthering my broader mission of be exposed to this field, right? This is where you guys are really fortunate to have the larger NSPN network, because those of us who have been around for a while or have been in the job market know a little bit about various relevant steps that you can take to drill down. So that's just sort of an example, and we can use that example moving forward as I explain the rest of the acronym. Attainable, right? Attainable as in, is this something that is within reach given my available resources? Resources both internal and external. Internally, am I able and willing to devote the effort required, right? What other things are going on in my life? If I'm currently in the knee deep in experiments and every waking hour is consumed with being in the lab, perhaps trying to apply for that fellowship next month is really not attainable because there's other stuff going on. Perhaps I don't have the resources that I need. If I'm a first year grad student saying, oh, I immediately want a job, next year, that might not be reasonable. And so it's sort of taking a realistic look at where you are, what you have, sort of what you could relatively, quickly attain in terms of support, to say to yourself, am I setting myself up for success just by first principle? Is there a critical resource that I'm lacking? And if so, are there ways, maybe via NSPN and other, such organizations that support grad students, that I could attain that? So this is a way of looking at gaps, right? Gaps that might help you say, ooh, I might need to put this particular objective on pause, or a gap that might say, oh, I realize I'm missing a really critical piece, right? And then you can sort of integrate that into your work plan to avoid getting stuck. Okay, relevant. This refers to how this particular objective, you want to make sure that it's furthering the long-term goal A really common place where I see maybe less relevant objectives being put onto a grad student agenda, specific to SciPol, is like, oh, you know, my PI says that I really need to publish this paper so I can get a SciPol job. And it's often like, well, it really depends. In my experience, most SciPol jobs do not require, you know, like a long publication history as a criteria for entry. It certainly may be a requirement of the lab, a requirement for you personally as a scientist, but that may not be an appropriate objective for the expose myself to science policy goal. You know, that may be an objective for, you know, a different mission that you're serving. So there may be things that are perfectly good to do, worthwhile to do, useful to do, but we want to be incredibly like laser and hawk-eyed focused. And when you're thinking of your specific meta goal, in the case of the first year student that's like, I want broad exposure, for that student to say, I need to publish in my field, irrelevant objective for that particular goal. Totally relevant for a different goal, but not for that goal, right? So this helps you get what I refer to as like some situational awareness, right? What really, really matters. So that way you're not sort of dispensing too much of your time and energy on things that aren't really furthering your purpose. So that's the first. Does this objective really further the mission? Is it something that needs to happen? Is it mission critical? Does it need to happen now? Is the timing lined up? There are goals that are more appropriate for senior students relative to first year students and so on. The other, I think, important one is considering, am I the right one to be accomplishing this task, or are there support roles needed? So this is just something to consider while we're looking at the elements of our SMART goals. And the last one, and one of my favorite ones, time bound. This sort of relates back to the M for metrics or measurable, setting deadlines. I'm such a big fan of back scheduling, particularly easy when there's an externally imposed date. And so it's, you know, ride or die, you know, you have to, you know, manage it. It can be harder when you're setting or imposing internal deadlines because, oh, you know, I set this arbitrary deadline for myself. This is where it's really key to have that self-discipline and perhaps to enlist your mentor or accountability buddies to really keep you on target and committed to that deadline, whether it's internally or externally imposed. So when you're thinking about your time, you have to consider not only how much time you have, but the pace at which you're going to be able to sit down and commit. Some people do well to work on their goal a little bit every day. Other people work well by doing large, intense chunks, you know, so maybe twice a week, they'll sit down and they'll just drill down for hours. You know you best. So when you're thinking about mapping out your time and your benchmarks, consider how often in a week or in a month that you're going to be you know, biting off chunks of this, your working rhythm. And then for me personally, whenever I'm playing on a project, I'll just throw in buffer time because, as we all know, life happens, stuff hits the fan. My magic number is I'll sort of establish a working timeline and then try to add 25 to 50% extra on the end of it for just, you know, stuff that comes up. You get sick, someone gets married, you have a very stressful week, you know, what have you. And then you can sort of accommodate for that human element without being too backed up. So that was our quick overview of the SMART, but where are some ways that we can trip ourselves up, right? The most common one that I run into is people being non-specific or vague when their objective is really kind of the goal itself. And so you have to be able to drill down, be specific, be tangible, be concrete with your actions. Some people, because we're an ambitious bunch, may set really pie in the sky, aspirational, but yet prohibitively difficult goals for themselves. And then you end up discouraged because you don't have the resources, you know, it's not timely or relevant to achieve it. And so then you may need to break it down into smaller goals. It's not timely, you don't have enough time, or you don't have the capacity to do it in the time provided. You may not have the right resources, or, and this is not one to be sort of shrugged at, maybe at the end of the day, you're like, gosh, I've been procrastinating, perhaps because I'm just fundamentally not interested. This is a goal perhaps that I feel that I should care about or that I want to care about, or there are just other more interesting things going on that are really occupying my attention. And it's okay to be honest with ourselves about that, right? Keeping up with goals is hard enough, particularly when one's heart isn't in it. And so this is just sort of a a way to check in with ourselves and say, am I motivated? And if not, sort of investigating or interrogating why that is. So we're making good on time. I was thinking that we could practice going through setting SMART objectives for our goals in breakout rooms. Here are some examples of goals that could be smartified. And I just put in a few, but you're welcome to, as a group, establish your own and talk about it together. So one could be, as I used as an example earlier, exploring SciPol job opportunities. A goal could be leading an NSPN program, being a leader in NSPN generally could be a goal. Publishing a SciPol memo could be a goal. Achieving a job or fellowship, some professional position, or finding high quality mentorship. Or you could come up with something that's relevant and personal to you. And so Annabelle here, I really appreciate it's going to help split us up into groups. I'm going to float around and just sort of comment or ask questions. But while Annabelle is putting us up into our sections, but I would pause and allow you guys to maybe ask me any questions you might have about this process, places that you might foresee having difficulties, or anything else that's on your mind. So I'll stop and the floor is yours.
Any questions? You can type them up in the chat and we can answer them there if you don't want to unmute. I do have a question actually, Chanel, before we go out into breakout rooms. Do folks have access to the slides, or could we get this just as at least this particular slide for folks to take with them into breakout rooms?
Absolutely. I have it both as a Google Drive and as a PowerPoint. And so we can put it into whatever anyone's preferred format is and share them with folks. It looks like we have 8, well, I guess seven folks, not including myself. So maybe we could do 3 breakout rooms. And that'll be nice and intimate and folks can dive in.
Awesome. I am going to do that. Let me get the timing.
What I'd like to do after we're in the breakout rooms for 10 minutes or so, if you guys could please pick a group representative, and when we come back to the main room, I'd love for that representative to talk a little bit about where you found it sort of easy to come up with these questions or specifics, but also where you found it hard. And I imagine that there may be commonalities between groups on, where there may have been difficulties, and perhaps we can learn from those together. And then I can provide, my own perspective. So with that, let's go.
Yeah, right before we go, there is a question in
great.
the chat. Anthony said, I tried to do some informational interviews with SciPol people a couple years ago when I was a graduate student, but didn't have any luck and didn't have more time. Any advice on how to find science policy people to interview who will respond?
That's such a great question. Thank you, Anthony. First, I want to acknowledge a great workshop that occurred earlier this week on reaching out via email, cold calling, leveraging LinkedIn for informational interviews and networking. So definitely want you to refer to that longer workshop. Thank you, Judith, for your message. But the short answer is one of the best predictors of future performance is past performance. So asking around to folks, who do you know is responsive, right? There's often sort of a short list of folks that are, responsive, reliable, really happy to give their time. So for example, you could ask me or ask other folks in NSPN leadership, who generally is able to turn around an email. And as far as it refers to a SMART goal, it can be tricky to set goals that rely so much on the behavior of other people, right? And so one can say, I'm going to have information interviews with this many folks, but then if many of them don't respond to you, you're like, gosh, I failed. One way to turn that goal around is to say, I'm going to reach out to these many people. That's something you can control, how many emails you may push in a week. Or I'm going to reach out to this many people on this many platforms. And then what comes in, comes in. I think psychologically, one thing that helps us sort of stay on track and motivated is setting ourselves up such that commitment to the process is in of itself its own reward, right? So regardless of whether or not someone gets back to you, bummer though that is, that you sent out, your, quanta of emails for that week or for that month, and you can feel really good about that. But to your question about how to find people that will respond to your messages, well, first of all, there are groups, like for example, if you happen to be African-American, there are groups like Black and Cy Paul that have their own website where people will advertise themselves as, please talk to me, you know, I welcome outreach. If you check out people on LinkedIn or Twitter, they may often have a byline that says, I'm happy to talk to students, or, you know, reach out to me. On LinkedIn, there's a great feature where you can see shared connections. So perhaps you can use a shared contact to get that warm introduction, you know, warm handoff, as opposed to a cold email. But certainly if this question is specific to you and you're looking for people to reach out to, I'd be happy to be a reference. So let me know.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I will stop the recording just because this section, of course, obviously isn't going to be recorded.